On the night of August the 18th, 2026, less than 2 hours before a 50% tariff was set to hit $20 billion of Canadian goods, Donald Trump picked up his phone and posted 7 words that changed the entire shape of the story. Subject to the finalization of documents, have a deal. That was it. No press conference, no signing ceremony. Just a late-night social media post, hours before the deadline, pulling the United States back from a tariff cliff it had built with its own hands. And the man on the other side of that phone call, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, had spent the better part of 18 months quietly building something Washington never fully priced in. A way out that didn't run through the White House at all. This is the story of how a president who has spent a decade treating trade as a weapon tried to corner one of America's oldest allies, and how the ally responded not with panic, but with patience. It's the story of tariffs that climbed from 25% to 35% to 50% in the span of 18 months. It's the story of a former central banker turned prime minister who did something almost no G7 leader has attempted at this scale. He started building an economy that didn't need Washington's permission to breathe. And, as of this week, according to the Associated Press, even the White House itself is now negotiating the fine print of a deal that Trump announced before it was fully written. Let's start where this pressure campaign actually began, because context matters here. Canada is not some minor trading partner picking a fight above its weight class. According to NBC News, more than $410 billion in goods crossed the Canada-US border in a single recent year, making Canada one of America's largest trading partners on the planet. Roughly 70% of everything Canada exports goes south into the United States. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, energy, lumber, agricultural products. The raw industrial bloodstream of an integrated North American economy that took 3 decades to build under NAFTA, and then its successor, the USMCA, or as Canadians call it, CUSMA. That interdependence used to be described as a strength. It is now, in Mark Carney's own words, delivered in a video address, a weakness that must be corrected. The tariff escalation didn't happen in one move. It happened in waves, each one larger than the last, and each one testing how much pressure Ottawa could absorb before it broke. Back in February 2025, Washington introduced a 25% tariff on Canadian goods not covered by the existing trade agreement, with a reduced 10% rate on energy products. Canada responded in kind. According to reporting from Global News, Ottawa hit back with retaliatory tariffs of its own within days, an eye-for-an-eye posture that set the tone for what would follow. By March 2025, Trump confirmed the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico were taking effect on schedule, and Canada, in turn, slapped 25% tariffs on billions of dollars of American goods. Neither side blinked first, then came the auto sector, which is the beating heart of industrial Ontario. In late March 2025, Trump announced a 25% tariff on imported automobiles and parts, and he made a point of saying, on camera, "This is permanent." Carney's response, as reported by the Associated Press, was some of the sharpest language he has used in this entire dispute. He called it a direct attack on Canada and said plainly, "We will defend our workers, we will defend our companies, we will defend our country." He didn't stop there. In the same appearance, Carney accused Washington of wanting to, in his words, own Canada, language that, coming from a sitting prime minister about America's closest ally, made headlines across the Canadian press. By the summer of 2025, the pattern was clear. Escalate, retaliate, threaten again. In July, Trump posted a letter on Truth Social announcing that starting August the 1st, the United States would impose a 35% tariff on Canadian goods not covered by CUSMA, layered on top of the sector-specific tariffs already in place on steel, aluminum, and autos. The letter, confirmed by both the BBC and NBC News, was one of more than 20 similar letters Trump sent to trading partners that week. But Canada's case stood out because of the scale of the relationship at stake. Trump's justification, in his own words on Truth Social, was that instead of working with the United States, Canada retaliated with its own tariffs. Carney's government pledged to keep protecting Canadian workers as the deadline approached. And on August the 1st, according to Global News, Trump followed through, signing the executive order that pushed the rate to 35%. Here's where the story usually gets told as a simple tale of an aggressive president bullying a smaller neighbor into submission. But that framing misses the second half of what was happening in Ottawa the entire time, and this is the part that didn't get nearly enough attention until very recently. While Trump was stacking tariff threat on top of tariff threat, Mark Carney was quietly executing a strategy that had almost nothing to do with Washington at all. Roughly every 30 seconds of this story, there's a new piece of the puzzle, and here's the next one. In January 2026, Carney flew to Beijing. It was his first visit to China since becoming prime minister, and according to a detailed analysis published in January 2026 and corroborated by Reuters, the visit produced a real, concrete agreement, not just a photo opportunity. Canada agreed to reduce tariffs allowing up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market, while Beijing committed to lowering its own import barriers on Canadian agricultural products, including canola seed, lobster, and peas. An opening expected to unlock nearly $3 billion in new export orders for Canadian farmers and fishers. Carney framed the trip, in his own words, as part of building a stronger, more independent Canadian economy and what he called a new strategic partnership, with China spanning energy, clean technology, and investment. Reuters described what Carney is attempting here in blunt terms. He is trying to lead a new global trading order, less reliant on the U.S. That's not spin from a Canadian government press release. That's how one of the world's most respected wire services characterized the strategy after speaking with Canadian trade officials. And it wasn't a one-country pivot. From Beijing, Carney's diplomatic calendar kept moving. He traveled to India, seeking to repair a relationship that had been frozen since 2024, after tensions escalated over the killing of a pro-Khalistan figure in British Columbia and the diplomatic fallout that followed. According to Carney's own statement announcing that trip, in a more uncertain world, Canada is focused on what we can control. From India, the itinerary extended to Australia and Japan, a full Asia-Pacific tour designed, according to multiple outlets covering the trip, to reduce Canada's dependence on a single trading partner that increasingly saw tariffs as a first resort rather than a last one. But China and the Indo-Pacific were only part of the diversification play. In February 2026, Carney met with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to deepen trade and security cooperation, and according to reporting from Trade Finance Global, the two countries began collaborating on something called the Defense, Security and Resilience Bank, a mechanism designed to finance and secure international supply chains outside the American orbit entirely. At the same time, Canada was pursuing deeper agreements with the European Union and with the CPTPP trade bloc, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which already includes Canada, the UK, and a dozen Pacific Rim economies. On the defense side, Canada committed to raising its military spending toward 5% of GDP, while directing 70% of that new spending toward domestic manufacturers rather than American defense contractors. Another quiet but deliberate move to loosen the dependency that had defined the Canada-US relationship since the Second World War. Here's the number that makes all of this matter, and it's worth repeating because it's the entire crux of the leverage story. The United States absorbs close to 70% of everything Canada exports. According to analysis from the Fraser Institute published in June 2026, Carney has set an explicit public target, doubling Canada's non-US exports by 2035. That's not a modest tweak to trade policy. That is a decade-long project to fundamentally rewire the plumbing of the Canadian economy so that a single American president, no matter how unpredictable, can no longer hold the entire country's export base hostage with the stroke of a pen. And this is exactly why the framing and the title of this story matters. Trump's tariff strategy against Canada was built on a very specific kind of leverage, the assumption that Canada had nowhere else to go. Cut off from the American market, the thinking went, Canadian industry would simply collapse, and Ottawa would have no choice but to accept whatever terms Washington offered. That leverage works perfectly, right up until the day it doesn't. And according to the Fraser Institute's own analysis, trade diversification is no longer just rhetoric out of Ottawa. It is a functioning, if still incomplete, alternative pathway that changes the calculus on both sides of the negotiating table. To be clear, and this is important for an honest accounting of where things actually stand, the Fraser Institute and other economists have raised real skepticism about how far this diversification can go, at least in the near term. The United States still buys close to 70% of Canadian exports, compared to the European Union's roughly 20% exposure to the US market. That gap doesn't close in a year, or probably even in 5. Analysts writing in Modern Diplomacy in January 2026 warned that deeper integration with China carries its own risks, Chinese exports increasingly being redirected away from an increasingly protectionist United States and into other markets could flood Canadian industries, creating a different kind of long-term vulnerability rather than solving the dependency problem outright. In other words, Plan B is real, it is being built, and it has already produced concrete agreements. But it is not a finished escape hatch. It's a hedge, not a full replacement. That distinction matters, and any honest version of this story has to include it, rather than pretend Canada has already achieved full independence from the US market, because it has not. So why did Trump blink on August the 18th? Why did a president who had just weeks earlier invoked what CNBC and other outlets described as a never-before-used legal authority? Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a Depression-era statute that hadn't been deployed in modern trade policy, suddenly pull back less than 2 hours before those 50% tariffs were set to take effect? Part of the answer is economic pain that was already showing up in real numbers, not just political rhetoric. According to CNBC, businesses on both sides of the border were describing the looming 50% tariff as, in the words of one affected business owner, deeply worrisome for a huge swath of Canadian businesses. The tariffs were set to hit a specific and politically sensitive basket of goods: wine, hockey sticks, dairy products, electronics, industrial machinery, and furniture. The kind of everyday consumer categories that show up in headlines and household budgets alike, not abstract trade statistics. TD Economics had modeled significant economic consequences if the full 50% tariff had gone into effect and stayed there, according to Time magazine's reporting on the standoff. There's also the retaliation Canada had already built into the relationship long before this latest deadline. According to Al Jazeera, 8 of Canada's 10 provinces had blocked sales of US-made alcoholic beverages since early the previous year. A symbolic but economically real form of retaliation that made clear Ottawa wasn't simply absorbing punishment passively. And Carney himself, in comments reported by PBS NewsHour, had described the trade talks in blunter terms than diplomats typically use in public, calling them nasty, after Trump had publicly criticized Canada's leadership. That's not the language of a government that felt cornered with no options. That's the language of a government negotiating from a position it had spent a year and a half building. Now here is where we have to be very careful and very honest, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a story like this can slide from the verified fact into wishful narrative, and the job here is to resist that. As of this recording, according to both the Associated Press and U.S. News and World Report, the actual terms of the deal Trump announced on August the 18th remain, in the words of U.S. News' own headline, unclear. Trump told reporters at the White House that talks with Canada had produced what he called a very fair deal for both sides, and he said on camera, "We no longer have any tariffs." But the president himself, in that same appearance, acknowledged the agreement was subject to the finalization of documents, meaning it was not yet a signed binding text at the time of that statement. According to a presidential proclamation released the same night, senior executive branch officials said Canada had expressed a commitment to remove the discriminations or unreasonable and unequal impositions that had triggered the 50% tariff threat in the first place. But the specific mechanisms of that commitment were not spelled out publicly. Trump also hinted, according to CNBC's reporting, that the deal could include restarting the Keystone XL pipeline project, the Alberta to Nebraska oil pipeline that was scrapped by President Biden back in 2021. He signaled that changes to U.S. tariffs on Canadian autos could be part of the package, and Carney himself suggested on social media that the deal might include the United States lowering its existing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer offered a more measured characterization, telling reporters, "We certainly, I think, have eliminated some of the irritants that we've had in the past year. None of these individual pieces, Keystone XL, the auto tariff changes, the steel and aluminum reductions, has been confirmed in a finalized public legal text as of this recording. They are the pieces being discussed, described by officials on both sides, but not yet locked into an agreement that trade lawyers and customs officials can actually implement at the border. That distinction between announced and finalized is not a technicality. In trade policy, it is everything, and previous rounds of this same standoff have shown announced deals falling apart before the ink dried. What we can say with confidence, because it's been confirmed by multiple named sources, including Trump's own social media statement, Carney's official response, and reporting from NBC, CNBC, Al Jazeera, and the Associated Press, is this: the 50% tariff was paused, not permanently canceled, for a 3-day window that Carney's office said would run until the end of the day on Friday, August the 21st. Carney's own statement, released through his office, struck a notably cautious tone rather than a victory lap tone. Substantial progress has been made, although there is important work still to be done. That is the language of someone who knows the document isn't signed yet, not someone declaring an outright win. It's worth pausing here to add one more layer of background, because understanding who Mark Carney actually is helps explain why this negotiating style looks so different from his predecessors. Carney came into the Prime Minister's office in March 2025, not as a career politician, but as a former central banker. He had previously run both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, two of the most consequential financial institutions in the world. That background matters here because it shapes how he talks about this dispute. He doesn't talk about tariffs primarily in nationalist or emotional terms, even when his language gets sharp, as it did when he accused Washington of wanting to own Canada. Mostly, he frames this as a balance sheet problem, an economy too concentrated in a single export market, carrying too much risk on a single counterparty, in need of diversification the same way a central banker would diversify a currency reserve. One of his first major moves in office, according to Global News, was announcing the removal of Canada's own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods that complied with CUSMA back in August 2025, a signal that even while diversifying away from dependency, his government wasn't interested in maximalist retaliation for its own sake. That's a notable data point because it shows the diversification strategy running alongside continued efforts to keep the core U.S. trading relationship functional, not replace it in a hostile break. The CUSMA question deserves its own moment here too, because it's arguably the single most consequential piece of unfinished business sitting underneath this entire dispute. The Canada-US-Mexico agreement, negotiated during Trump's first term as the replacement for NAFTA, is up for a mandatory review this year, according to Chatham House's January 2026 analysis. That review matters enormously, because CUSMA is what currently allows the bulk of Canadian exports to cross into the United States tariff-free, provided they meet the agreement's rules of origin. Trump has publicly cast doubt on renewing it at all. According to Global News video coverage from January 2026, he described the agreement's future as irrelevant to me when asked directly about renewal. That's a striking thing for a sitting president to say about a trade agreement he personally negotiated and signed less than a decade earlier, and it's exactly the kind of uncertainty that has pushed Carney's government to treat diversification not as an optional strategic nicety, but as a genuine hedge against the possibility that the entire tariff-free framework underpinning Canada-US trade could be renegotiated on far less favorable terms, or not renewed at all. There's also an important wrinkle in how Section 338 itself works, because it explains why this particular tariff threat felt different from everything that came before it. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 is a provision that, according to CNBC's reporting, had never actually been used in the modern era of American trade policy before Trump invoked it against Canada in 2026. It allows the president to impose tariffs of up to 50% on a country the administration determines is engaged in discriminatory treatment of American commerce, a much more aggressive and more specifically targeted tool than the broader global tariff framework that the Supreme Court had already struck down earlier in the year. Legal experts covering the story noted that reaching for a Depression-era statute, dormant for nearly a century, signaled just how determined the administration was to maintain tariff leverage over Ottawa specifically, even after losing its broader tariff authority in court. That detail alone tells you this was never treated by Washington as a routine trade dispute. It was treated as a priority fight, worth digging up century-old legal tools to keep fighting. So let's step back and ask the real analytical question here, because that's ultimately what separates an actual geopolitical breakdown from a highlight reel of headlines. Did Carney's diversification strategy, the trip to Beijing, the outreach to India, the UK Defence Bank, the CPTPP push, the doubled non-US export target, actually change the leverage dynamic in this specific negotiation? Or is that a flattering narrative being layered onto what is, more simply, two governments negotiating hard because a trade war genuinely hurts both economies? The honest answer sits somewhere in between, and it's worth walking through carefully rather than picking the more dramatic version just because it makes for a better headline. On one hand, the raw numbers on trade dependency haven't moved dramatically yet. Canada still sends roughly 70% of its exports to the United States, a figure that several of the sources in this research, the Fraser Institute, Modern Diplomacy, Chatham House, all cite consistently as of 2026. A decade-long project to double non-US exports by 2035 is, by definition, not going to show up as a dramatic shift in the trade balance within 18 months. So if you're looking for hard evidence that Canada has already replaced the American market, that evidence doesn't exist yet, and anyone telling you otherwise is overselling the story. On the other hand, leverage in a negotiation isn't only about current trade volumes. It's also about credibility, optionality, and the political cost of escalation. And here, the shift is real, and it is documented. Chatham House, the respected London-based Foreign Policy Institute, published an analysis in January 2026, explicitly framing Carney's China visit within a broader context. It called de-risking from America, a phrase originally used to describe how countries were reducing dependency on China, now being applied in reverse, to describe how allies are reducing dependency on an unpredictable United States. That's a remarkable inversion, and it's not Canadian government spin. It's an independent foreign policy institution's read on where the wind is blowing. When Reuters describes Carney as trying to lead a new global trading order, and when Chatham House frames the same behavior as de-risking from America, you're looking at outside, nonpartisan validation that something structurally different is happening in how U.S. allies approach Washington, not just Canadian talking points dressed up as strategy. And there's a political dimension, too, that shouldn't be underestimated. Every time Carney signs a new agreement, with China on agriculture and electric vehicles, with the UK on defense financing, with India on rebuilding a fractured relationship, it becomes just a little bit harder for Washington to assume Canada has no alternative but to accept whatever terms are offered. It doesn't eliminate the tariff pain in the short term, Businesses in Ontario's auto sector and Quebec's dairy sector were still absorbing real costs throughout 2025 and into 2026, tariffs Trump himself confirmed and defended publicly. But it changes the negotiating posture over time, the same way a company with one supplier has less leverage than a company that has spent 2 years quietly qualifying 3 backup suppliers, even if it hasn't switched away from the original one yet. That's arguably the most useful way to understand what's actually happened here, rather than the more dramatic, Trump's leverage destroyed framing that headlines tend to favor. Carney didn't build a weapon that instantly neutralized American tariff power. He built an insurance policy, methodically, deal by deal, country by country, over roughly 18 months, while simultaneously staying at the negotiating table with Washington the entire time, never walking away, never fully burning the relationship that still accounts for the overwhelming majority of Canadian trade. Carney's own framing, in the video address covered by Euronews back in April 2026, captured this balancing act precisely. He described the U.S. relationship as something that was once a strength, but is now a weakness that must be corrected. Not something to be abandoned, but something to be rebalanced. Let's talk about the human and economic stakes underneath all of this policy language, because it's easy to lose sight of what tariffs actually do to real industries. The Canadian auto sector, concentrated heavily in Ontario cities like Oshawa and Windsor, has been directly in the crosshairs since Trump's 25% auto tariff in March 2025. Images from Oshawa, captured by Reuters on the day the 50% tariff pause was announced in August 2026, showed vehicles parked outside a GM assembly plant. A quiet, almost mundane image that nonetheless captured an entire industry holding its breath, waiting to see whether a factory's output would suddenly cost half again as much to sell into its largest market. Dairy farmers in Quebec, wine producers in British Columbia and Ontario's Niagara region, hockey equipment manufacturers, these aren't abstract line items in a trade dispute. They're the specific, named categories of goods that Trump's 50% tariff targeted, according to CNBC's detailed breakdown of the proclamation. And the pain wasn't one-directional either, which is a detail that often gets lost in coverage that frames this purely as Trump versus Canada. According to Carney's own public remarks, reported by the Associated Press, American consumer confidence had fallen to what he described as a multi-year low amid the broader trade war, a point he made specifically to argue that the tariffs were hurting Americans too, not just Canadians. That's a claim worth flagging honestly. It's Carney's characterization, delivered for obvious political effect in the middle of a negotiation. And while U.S. consumer confidence data has genuinely shown weakness during this period, attributing that weakness specifically and solely to the Canada tariffs, as opposed to the much larger web of global tariffs Trump imposed on dozens of countries simultaneously, is Carney's interpretation, rather than an independently isolated, confirmed causal fact. Good analysis means flagging that distinction rather than repeating a politician's framing as settled science. There's also a broader legal wrinkle worth mentioning honestly, because it shapes how durable any of this really is. According to Time magazine's reporting, the majority of Trump's global tariffs, the sweeping ones imposed across dozens of countries under a broader executive framework, were struck down by a Supreme Court ruling earlier in 2026. That ruling didn't eliminate every tariff Trump had imposed. The Canada-specific 50% tariff under Section 338 was a separate legal mechanism, one that Trump's team turned to specifically, according to CNBC, because it offered a different legal basis than the tariffs the court had just invalidated. That's a significant detail, because it tells you Trump's negotiating team was actively searching for legally durable ways to keep tariff pressure on Ottawa, even after losing ground in the courts, which in turn tells you how central the Canada relationship has become to the administration's broader trade strategy, and how determined it has been to keep leverage in play by whatever legal mechanism remains available. So where does this actually leave things as of this recording? The 50% tariff is paused, not canceled, through a short window that both governments describe as time to finalize a more permanent document. The broader relationship remains, in Carney's own careful words, a situation where substantial progress has been made, but important work still remains. Canada's diversification strategy, the China agreements, the India outreach, the UK Defence Financing Partnership, the CPTPP push, continues to run in parallel, not as a replacement for the US relationship, but as a genuine hedge against exactly the kind of pressure campaign Washington has run over the past 18 months. And crucially, neither side has fully closed the door. Trump wants a deal that lets him claim a win on trade fairness. Carney wants a deal that protects Canadian industry without abandoning the diversification project he's spent a year and a half building. Those two goals aren't necessarily incompatible, which may be exactly why both men found reason to step back from the cliff edge on August the 18th, rather than let the 50% tariff actually take effect. It's also worth zooming out to the international audience watching all of this unfold, because Canada is not the only country running this exact playbook right now, and that context changes how you should read the Ottawa story. According to the same Chatham House analysis referenced earlier, the European Union has been weighing its own countermeasures in response to a separate and unrelated Trump pressure campaign, this one involving Greenland and Denmark, a NATO ally. That's a telling parallel. When Reuters described countries forging new alliances and trading partnerships with new urgency, it wasn't describing an isolated Canadian reaction to one difficult American president. It was describing a broader pattern among longtime U.S. allies who were independently concluding that the assumptions underpinning 70 years of American-led economic order can no longer be taken for granted from one administration to the next. Financial Times commentary, cited in that same analysis, described this trend as de-risking from America, deliberately borrowing language originally used to describe Western countries reducing their exposure to China and applying it in reverse. That inversion is genuinely significant because it suggests the pressure campaign against Canada isn't just reshaping Ottawa's strategy in isolation. It may be quietly reshaping how a much wider circle of U.S. allies think about their own economic exposure to Washington, regardless of who occupies the White House next. That broader context also helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange: why Carney has been careful throughout this entire 18-month standoff not to frame his diversification push as an anti-American project. In nearly every public statement referenced in this research, from the Economic Club of New York speech covered by the Fraser Institute, to the video address covered by Euronews, to his comments after the March 2025 auto tariffs, Carney consistently frames the goal as balance, not rupture. He explicitly called for what the Fraser Institute described as a new partnership between Canada and the United States, one that recognizes the deep economic integration between the two countries in sectors like manufacturing and energy, even while simultaneously pursuing what he calls strategic autonomy elsewhere. That's a genuinely difficult political tightrope to walk, reassuring Washington that Canada isn't abandoning the relationship, while simultaneously building the infrastructure to survive if Washington keeps escalating anyway. Whether that balancing act holds together through a full CUSMA renegotiation, or whether it eventually tips more decisively toward the diversification side of the ledger, is probably the single most important open question hanging over Canada-U.S. relations for the remainder of this decade. Before we close, here's the honest accounting this story deserves, because transparency about sourcing matters more than ever on a topic this contested. The tariff timeline and figures in this script are drawn from named checkable reporting: the Associated Press, Reuters, NBC News, CNBC, Al Jazeera, the BBC, PBS NewsHour, NPR, Time Magazine, and U.S. News and World Report, along with direct statements from President Trump on Truth Social, official statements from Prime Minister Carney's office, and on-record comments from U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer. The trade diversification details, the China agreement, the India and Asia-Pacific tour, the UK Defence Bank, the CPTPP push, and the 70% export dependency figures are drawn from Reuters' own analysis, the Fraser Institute, Chatham House, Modern Diplomacy, and Trade Finance Global. What remains, genuinely unverified, and should be treated as such rather than reported as settled fact, is the specific final content of the August 2026 deal itself. Whether Keystone XL will actually restart, what exact new tariff rates will apply on autos, steel, and aluminum, and how Canada's provinces will handle their own retaliatory alcohol restrictions going forward. Those details, as of this recording, exist only as hints, suggestions, and characterizations from officials on both sides, not as a finalized published legal text. Any version of the story that presents those specifics as locked-in fact is getting ahead of what's actually been confirmed. And that's a distinction worth holding on to as this continues to develop in the days ahead. If you've made it this far, you've probably noticed this is a story that keeps evolving in real time, a 3-day pause that could become a real settlement, or could collapse right back into the 50% tariff threat the moment those documents fail to materialize. That's exactly the kind of story where staying subscribed actually matters, because whichever way this breaks in the coming days will shape Canada-US trade for years, and we'll be tracking every update as it lands, not weeks later. If this kind of grounded, source-by-source breakdown of how global power actually gets negotiated is useful to you, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the follow-up the moment Ottawa or Washington makes its next move. And if you want to actually understand how these bigger diversification plays, China, India, the CPTPP, reshape the map over the next few years, rather than just reacting to headlines as they drop, that's exactly the kind of deeper analysis this channel keeps building toward. So staying subscribed puts you ahead of that curve rather than catching up to it later. So here's the question worth sitting with. Has Mark Carney actually found a durable way to reduce Canada's exposure to this kind of pressure, or is trade diversification, at least for now, more of a negotiating chip than a real structural shift, one that still leaves 70% of Canadian exports tied to the mood of a single president in Washington? Let us know what you think the honest read on this actually is. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.